Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the silk-lined, wine-stained corridors of medieval Europe, where crowns weren't just symbols of power, they were accessories to debauchery. Picture this. You're standing in a torchlit hall, the air thick with the musk of sweat, spilled mead, and something far more primal. A king lounges on a fur-draped throne, his fingers tracing the curves of a goblet, or perhaps the waist of a courtier who definitely isn't his queen. This isn't some scandalous rumor whispered in taverns. It's history, raw and unvarnished. And trust me, if you were dropped into this world unprepared, you probably wouldn't survive the intrigue or the syphilis. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see just how far this twisted bedtime story travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the 10th century, where King Erik VIII of Sweden, nicknamed Erik the Lover, or Erik the Shameless, depending on who you asked, ruled with an iron scepter and an insatiable appetite. His court chroniclers wrote of feasts where guests were expected to indulge in every vice imaginable, and if you refused, well, let's just say the dungeons were always hungry. Erik didn't just collect taxes. He collected lovers, allegedly keeping a ledger of every noblewoman and a few noblemen he'd bedded, ranked by enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether this ledger was real or just medieval propaganda. But given the man's track record, would you put it past him? Then there's the really juicy bit, Erik's obsession with trial by orgasm. Yes, you heard that right. When disputes arose in his court, he sometimes settled them by pitting accuser and accused in a private competition to see who could, persuade a chosen arbitrator the most convincingly. Spoiler, the king often played referee. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if modern reality TV is really the peak of absurdity. But here's the mainstream fact to ground us. Medieval kings often used marriage as political strategy. While Erik was busy turning his throne room into a boudoir, rulers like Charlemagne were carefully wedding and discarding wives to forge alliances. The difference? Charlemagne got sainted. Erik got a reputation that would make a pirate blush. And now, the quirky tidbit. One of Erik's supposed conquests was a Finnish who, according to legend, taught him how to brew a lust potion using crushed rubies and fermented honey. Did it work? Who knows? But it explains why Sweden's treasury was briefly very low on gemstones. As you sink deeper into the furs of this story, remember, behind every scandal was a throne, and behind every throne was a bed. And in medieval Europe, that bed was rarely empty. The flickering torchlight of Erik's hall fades as we cross into even darker territory, where kings didn't just indulge in lovers, but built entire systems around them. You're no longer in Sweden. Now, you're navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Alhambra, where the air smells of orange blossoms and whispered secrets. Here, the concept of the harem wasn't just exotic fantasy, it was political engineering. And nobody engineered quite like Alfonso IX of Leon. This was a man who turned marriage into a revolving door, wedding two of his first cousins, not at the same time, but with barely a breath between annulments. The Pope excommunicated him twice, but Alfonso just shrugged and kept collecting wives like rare coins. His court became a living soap opera. Jealous queens, bastard heirs jockeying for favor, and a king who seemed to believe diplomacy worked best when conducted in bed. Historians still argue whether Alfonso was a strategic genius or just a man who really, really loved weddings. Then there's Henry VIII, yes, that Henry, whose infamous 6 wives overshadow an even wilder truth. He didn't just want new spouses, he wanted the idea of them. Before the beheadings and the religious upheaval, young Henry was a golden-haired Renaissance party prince, jousting in tight leggings and writing love songs so bad they made his mistresses cringe. One surviving lyric, "My heart is like a falcon, trapped in your blouse." But here's the fringe tidbit they don't teach in school. Henry's court maintained a fool's registry, a secret list of noblewomen ranked by their compliancy to the king's advances. If you resisted, Suddenly, your father's taxes doubled. Coincidence? Sure. But let's not forget the mainstream anchor. Royal harems weren't just about sex. They were power structures. In Islamic Iberia, sultans used them to forge alliances without warfare, integrating conquered noblewomen as wives rather than enemies. Meanwhile, over in England, Henry's bedroom politics literally birthed a new church. And now, the deliciously weird detail. Alfonso IX's third wife, Berengaria, was such a master of intrigue that she allegedly smuggled messages to her allies inside hollowed-out figures. When Alfonso discovered this, he didn't punish her. He commissioned a portrait of her holding the figs, captioned "Love is fruitful." Medieval trolling at its finest. As the candle gutters low, remember this. Behind every royal scandal was a throne trembling under its own weight. And the beds? They were never just beds. They were chessboards. The scent of incense and hypocrisy hangs thick as we push open the gilded doors of the Vatican itself, where silk robes hid sins far darker than Alfonso's fig-filled intrigues. You're in Rome now, where popes preached chastity from the pulpit by day, and by night, hosted banquets so debauched that even Henry VIII would have raised an eyebrow. Take Alexander VI, the bourgeois pope who turned the Holy See into a family business, and his daughter Lucrezia into a political pawn and a rumored lover. Yes, you heard that right. Historians still argue whether the whispers of incest were true or just black propaganda from rival families. But given that Alexander openly hosted orgies in the Apostolic Palace, the line between slander and truth gets blurry. His private chambers featured a fresco of the Virgin Mary, positioned directly above his bed, because nothing says holiness like multitasking. Then there's John XII, dubbed the boy pope for taking the throne at 18, and promptly using it as a literal playground. Chronicles claim he turned St. Peter's Basilica into a brothel, toasted to Satan during Mass, and died mid-adultery when an outraged husband allegedly smote him upon the head mid-coitus. The Vatican's official record? Sudden death by apoplexy. Sure. But here's the mainstream anchor. The Catholic Church's celibacy rule wasn't even enforced until the 12th century. Before that, popes openly had wives and children. Some, like Innocent VIII, proudly displayed their bastard sons at court. One even got made a cardinal at age 7. Now for the bizarre tidbit. Pope Paul II's ruby lips. Obsessed with youth, he allegedly had courtesans rub crushed rubies into his lips daily to keep them rosy, until one overzealous servant ground the gems too coarse, leaving the Pope lisping through bloody gums for weeks. As the last echoes of Gregorian chant fade, remember, in these hallowed halls, the only real sin was getting caught. The murmur of papal intrigues fades as we slip into the shadows of the Seraglio, where the real power players weren't kings or popes, but the eunuchs who guarded them. You're in Constantinople now, breathing in the heavy perfume of jasmine and betrayal. Here, castrated men held the keys to empires, their high-pitched voices whispering secrets that could make or break dynasties. Picture this. You're a towering Nubian eunuch in the court of Justinian, your smooth cheeks glistening in the lamplight as you pour wine for the emperor. But your real job? Ensuring his wife Theodora's private entertainers never overstay their welcome. Theodora, a former actress whose scandalous past included performing with live geese, interpret that as you will, relied on eunuchs to scrub her history clean, sometimes literally, with lie and bribes. Historians still argue whether Byzantine eunuchs were victims or master manipulators, but their account books tell the truth. They owned more property than most nobles. Then there's Piers Gaveston, the favourite of Edward II of England, a man so close to the king that chroniclers claimed they shared clothes, crowns, and carnal knowledge. When Edward's nobles demanded Gaveston's exile, the king sent him away with a going-away present, the entire royal treasury. Spoiler: Gaveston didn't stay exiled long. But here's the mainstream fact. Eunuchs weren't just sexual gatekeepers. In China's Forbidden City, they handled state documents, and occasionally, entire wars, because emperors trusted neutered men not to build rival dynasties. Now for the quirk, the singing knives of Abbasid Baghdad. Certain eunuchs specialized in vocal castration, surgically altering their voices to mimic women's tones without full emasculation. The caliphs prized them as living instruments, their eerie songs soundtracking everything from state dinners to executions. As the moon glints off a eunuch's dagger, remember, In a world obsessed with bloodlines, the powerless often held the sharpest blades. The hush of the seraglio fades as we step into the most forbidden chamber of all, the blood-tangled bedrooms where crowns and kin collided. You're in Ptolemaic Egypt now, where Cleopatra VII didn't just marry her brother, she ruled him, bedded him, and ultimately had him poisoned when his usefulness expired. But this wasn't some outlier, it was dynasty policy. The Ptolemies were so committed to keeping their Greek bloodline pure that siblings marrying siblings became as routine as sunrise over Alexandria. Historians still argue whether their rampant inbreeding caused their famed beauty or their eventual genetic collapse. Cleopatra's grandmother was also her aunt, let that sink in. Then there's the Habsburgs of Europe, who turned incest into an imperial strategy. Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, was born with a jaw so deformed he couldn't chew, a tongue so thick he drooled through sermons, and a list of ailments longer than the royal family tree, which, by the way, was more of a wreath, given how many branches looped back on themselves. His autopsy report noted his body contained not one drop of uncorrupted blood. Yet for centuries, Habsburgs kept marrying cousins, nieces, even uncles, all because they trusted family treason less than outsider betrayal. But here's the mainstream anchor. Royal incest wasn't about lust, it was about control. From Hawaiian Pio marriages to the god kings of Mesopotamia, keeping power in the family meant keeping challengers out. Now for the bizarre twist, the bridal chest of Byzantium. Before wedding their sisters, some emperors required their brides-to-be to submit to a purity exam, conducted via a hollowed-out statue of the Virgin Mary. The bride would sit inside while doctors inspected her through strategically placed holes, because nothing says holy matrimony like gynecology via religious art. As the torchlight catches the sheen of sweat on a royal marriage bed, remember, the darkest desires often wore crowns. The cloying scent of royal bloodlines fades as we enter a darker chamber, where romance wore the metallic tang of fear. You're in the Tower of London now, where Anne Boleyn's ghost still whispers beneath the scaffold shadow. Henry VIII's most infamous queen didn't just lose her head, she spent years as a prisoner of his obsession, her initial no to his advances twisted into a death sentence disguised as courtship. Historians still argue whether Anne was a master manipulator or a woman trapped in a game where the rules changed hourly. But her final letter, written days before the executioner's sword flashed, holds one undeniable truth. You have chosen me from low estate to be your queen, yet now I must prepare my soul for God. Then there's the chilling case of Agnes Bernora, the commoner who dared marry a Bavarian duke. His father, fearing diluted bloodlines, had her bound and thrown into the Danube as courtiers watched from a gilded barge, an event recorded as the bathing. The duke retaliated by burning 3 of his father's villages. Medieval love stories rarely ended with kisses. But here's the mainstream anchor. Royal marriages were rarely consensual. Queens like Marguerite of Burgundy were locked in iron chastity belts when their husbands went to war, while others endured bedding ceremonies where witnesses literally watched the marriage get consummated. Now for the macabre twist, the dance of the veils. In some courts, noble women accused of rejecting a king's advances were forced to perform an erotic dance while slowly removing layers of clothing, until they stood bare before the court's judgment. Refusal meant treason. Compliance meant shame. There were no winning moves. As the last veil flutters to the stones, remember, in palaces, even whispers could be shackles. The echoes of Anne Boleyn's final plea fade as we push open a hidden door, one that leads to a velvet-draped chamber where kings didn't just break rules, they shattered them with a wink. You're in the French court now, where the air smells of lavender and lies, and King Philip IV's scandalous secret whispers through the tapestries. His brother Charles was so fond of his favourite knight, they shared a bed for 30 years. When the knight died, Charles had him buried in the royal crypt, an honour previously reserved for queens. Then there's Richard the Lionheart, whose close friendship with King Philip Augustus of France had chroniclers snickering about how they ate from the same dish, slept in the same bed, and by night, what more shall I say? Historians still argue whether these relationships were sexual or just intense medieval bromance. But when the Pope himself wrote Richard a letter scolding his sinful acts with men, it's hard to play dumb. But here's the mainstream fact. Same-sex relationships among nobility were often tolerated, until they weren't. Edward II's downfall began when his nobles murdered his lover Gaveston and allegedly punished Edward with a hot poker execution, a symbolic end for a king who burned for the wrong person. Now for the deliciously weird detail, the Order of the Garter. Founded by Edward III, its motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, allegedly came from when a lady's garter slipped off during a dance. But some whisper it was really about his father's scandal, a cheeky mind-your-business to judgmental nobles. As the candle gutters low, remember, in palaces, the most dangerous love affairs wore crowns. The whispers of forbidden love fade as we step into a candlelit chamber where the air hums with something darker, incense mixed with the acrid tang of melted wax and ambition. You're in the court of King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, a monarch so obsessed with the occult that he penned Demonology, a manual on witchcraft, between drafting love letters to his male favourites. His fascination wasn't academic, it was deeply personal. When his cousin, the Earl of Bothwell, was accused of using dark magic to seduce him, James didn't deny it. He had the Earl tried for witchcraft, then pardoned him after a private midnight meeting. Historians still argue whether James truly feared magic or just enjoyed the theatre of it, but his court became a stage where lust and the supernatural blurred. Then there's Gilles de Rais, the French nobleman and Joan of Arc's comrade-in-arms who later descended into depravity. After dabbling in alchemy to restore his fortune, fund his debauchery, he turned to darker rituals, child sacrifices, blood pacts, and summoning demons to fuel his increasingly grotesque appetites. When finally arrested, his trial revealed a library of grimoires annotated with creative interpretations of biblical passages. The mainstream fact. Witch trials among nobility were often less about superstition and more about silencing rivals or explaining away unholy desires. Now for the bizarre twist, the devil's mark obsession. Kings like James employed witch prickers, men who roamed courts probing nobles' bodies for insensitive spots, excuses to strip-search enemies. One French duchess was nearly condemned because a mole behind her knee was deemed too shapely to be natural. As the last candle sputters, remember, in these halls, the real magic was always power, and the darkest spells were cast in bedrooms, not grimoires. The scent of melted wax and dark magic lingers as we enter a chamber draped in crimson silk, where pain wasn't punishment, but pleasure, and power played out in gasps and golden chains. You're in the private quarters of Emperor Tiberius now, where the line between ruler and dominatrix blurred into obscenity. His villa on Capri wasn't just a retreat, it was a psychosexual playground, with frescoed walls depicting scenes so graphic that even his biographer Suetonius claimed words fail me. And this was a man who chronicled Caligula's incest. Tiberius allegedly trained young boys as minnows. They'd dart between his legs in pools, nibbling at him where the sun doesn't shine until he roared with laughter, or something else. Historians still argue whether these tales were true or political smear campaigns, but given that Tiberius spent his final years on Capri while Rome burned, it's clear he prioritized private governance. Then there's the Iron Maiden myth, not the medieval torture device, though those existed, but the rumored pleasure contraption of Vlad the Impaler. While he's famed for skewering enemies, whispers persist that his wife had a special iron corset lined with fur and strategically placed spikes. The mainstream fact. Medieval BDSM was often about control theatre. Queens like Catherine de' Medici hosted Ballet des Fers, where nobles performed in elaborate metal restraints, blurring art and arousal. Now for the quirk, the Pear of Anguish, a pear-shaped metal device allegedly used to punish, stimulate erogenous zones. While mostly a myth, one French duke's inventory listed a silver pear for the lady's chastening, right next to his collection of silk whips. As the last chain clinks softly, remember, in palaces, even agony could be a crown's privilege. The whisper of chains fades into the sharpening of knives as we enter the most dangerous game of all, royal revenge. You're in the court of King Louis XIV now, where the Sun King's gilded halls hid a festering rot, the affair of the poisons. Nobles weren't just cheating on spouses, they were hiring witches to brew inheritance powder, arsenic, to speed up their promotions. But the real scandal. The king's own mistress, Madame de Montespan, allegedly dabbled in black masses to keep Louis favor, involving nude rituals, infant sacrifices, and a priest who claimed Satan told him the king's scepter shall rise only for you. Historians still argue whether she truly participated or was framed, but when your love rival ends up mysteriously convulsing after tasting your special chocolate, suspicions tend to linger. Then there's the cuckold's horn, a literal trumpet blown through castle halls when a nobleman discovered his wife's infidelity. In Denmark, King Christian IV had horns mounted above the beds of offending couples, then forced them to host banquets beneath their shame. But the mainstream fact: adultery was often political warfare. When Queen Margot of France took a lover, her husband Henry III accidentally had the man killed during a hunt, then gifted her his embalmed heart in a velvet box. Now for the deliciously petty twist, the reverse cuckold of Bavaria. Duke Wilhelm V commissioned a clockwork automaton of his wife's lover, which, when wounded, performed an obscene pantomime before being beheaded by a tiny guillotine every hour. She retaliated by displaying it in her salon as my husband's favorite toy. As the last chime of revenge echoes, remember, in palaces, even love letters could be declarations of war. The metallic scent of revenge fades as we enter the nursery, but don't be fooled by the gilded cribs and embroidered swaddling. These were the battlegrounds where bastard heirs and legitimate princes played a lethal game of musical thrones. You're in the court of William the Conqueror now, a man who literally fought his way out of the bastard label to become king. His mother, Herleva, was a tanner's daughter who caught Duke Robert's eye while dancing barefoot on a Normandy beach, or, in raunchier versions, washing laundry with her skirts hitched high. William spent his life proving bloodlines mattered less than battle prowess, until his own son, Henry I, sired at least 24 illegitimate children just to hedge his bets. Historians still argue whether this was strategic genius or a man wildly overcompensating for his dad's insecurities. Then there's the bourgeois solution to bastardy. Pope Alexander VI simply faked a papal bull declaring his children legitimate, then married daughter Lucrezia off 3 times before she turned 20. Her second wedding featured a fertility dance so graphic, cardinals fainted. Meanwhile, in Russia, Empress Elizabeth stole a newborn heir from a rival's womb, literally having her guards surround the pregnant princess until labor began, then raising the boy as her own. But here's the mainstream anchor: royal bastards shaped history. The Tudors descended from John of Gaunt's illegitimate Beaufort line, while Spain's great captain Gonzalo Fernandez was the bastard son of a priest and became the terror of Italy. Now for the bizarre twist: the cradle plot of 15th-century Portugal. To prove a prince was legitimate, nobles staged an elaborate test. They placed the screaming infant on a table with 2 objects, a crucifix and a bottle of wine. When he chose the crucifix, Reed was nudged by a hidden string. The court declared God's will and conveniently ignored his mother's 12 documented lovers. As the last lullaby hums through the nursery, remember, in palaces, even cribs were chessboards. The scent of baby powder and betrayal fades as we push open a door crusted with peeling gold leaf, revealing a room where the walls sweat perfume and the velvet drapes are frayed from clutching hands. Welcome to the brothel king's domain, where monarchs didn't just visit pleasure houses, they built their own. You're in Versailles Park Auxiliary Serfs now, Louis XV's private harem disguised as a hunting lodge. Here, the king kept a rotating stable of teenage girls, recruited from convents and opera houses with promises of dowries, only to be discarded like soiled lace after a single night. His valet kept meticulous records, Mademoiselle de 20 mois, yes, they were catalogued by duration of service, reportedly received a bonus of 10,000 livres for exceptional flexibility. Historians still argue whether this was exploitation or enlightened patronage, but when your hunting lodge has more silk beds than actual stables, it's hard to claim moral high ground. Then there's Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, who allegedly bankrupted the treasury to build a movable brothel, a gilded carriage pulled by oxen, its interior lined with mirrors and cushions, where he'd copulate while being paraded through Istanbul. When his viziers protested, he had them drowned in the Bosphorus, using sacks lined with jewels so they'd sink slower. But here's the mainstream fact: state-sponsored brothels were medieval economic policy. Pope Sixtus IV taxed Roman prostitutes to fund St. Peter's Basilica, while French kings sold license medals to brothel workers, the 15th-century version of a health certificate. Now for the jaw-dropping quirk: the orgy clock of Saxony. Augustus the Strong commissioned a timepiece where, on the hour, miniature gold figures would enact Kama Sutra positions, until his Lutheran wife smashed it with a fireplace poker. The repairs cost more than a warship. As the last chime of decadence echoes, remember, in these rooms, even time was measured in thrusts. The cloying musk of brothel perfume dissolves into something sharper, antiseptic, herbal, and tinged with decay. You're in a 16th century plague ward now, where syphilis has just crash-landed in Europe like a biological atom bomb, and kings are weirdly invested in its spread. Meet King Francis I of France, who called syphilis the Neapolitan gift, blaming it on Spanish troops, even as his own pustules oozed onto the Louvre's silk sheets. His treatment: mercury baths so toxic, courtiers could track his whereabouts by the puddles of his sweat, which, incidentally, contained enough quicksilver to poison a village well. Historians still argue whether his famed last words, "all is lost save honor," referred to his kingdom, or his ability to urinate without screaming. Then there's the Great Pox paradox. The same monarchs who banned brothels during outbreaks quietly installed sanctioned courtesans in palace basements. Elizabeth I's Surgeon General even published a pamphlet claiming the French disease could be cured by bedding virgins, leading to a suspicious spike in convent kidnappings. Meanwhile, Pope Clement VII banned kissing during Mass, not for piety, but because his own syphilitic sores made it agony to touch chalices. But here's the mainstream anchor. Syphilis reshaped global politics. When Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494, his troops didn't just bring cannons, they unleashed the Black Venus across the continent, decimating armies more effectively than gunpowder. Now for the jaw-dropping quirk, the condom trials of 1564. To curb infections, Gabriele Falloppio, yes, that Falloppio, tested linen sheaths soaked in mercury solution on prisoners. The survival rate: better than the pox, per his notes. As the quarantine bells toll, remember, in palaces, even plagues became power plays. The stench of mercury and rotting flesh gives way to something richer: roasted peacock, spiced wine, and the underlying musk of bodies pressed too close in candlelit banquet halls. You're at the last forbidden feast of King Christian VII of Denmark, a monarch so devoted to excess that he hosted a 17-course dinner where every dish was literally gilded, including the napkins embroidered with gold thread so stiff, guests blotted their mouths raw. His court physician later wrote that the king's bowels shone like Midas' touch for weeks. But this wasn't just gluttony. It was the dying gasp of medieval decadence before revolutions rose. Historians still argue whether Christian's madness, he believed his semen turned to gold, was congenital or induced by a lifetime of swallowing virility tonics containing ground rubies. Then there's the swan song supper of Poland's King Augustus II, who, facing rebellion, hosted a final banquet featuring a live bear dressed as a bishop, forced to bless each course. A fountain-spouting Hungarian wine mixed with powdered pearls. Dessert served on the naked bodies of his remaining mistresses. When rebels stormed the palace at dawn, they found Augustus dead, not from violence, but from attempting to outdrink a Cossack chieftain in a loyalty contest. But here's the mainstream fact: the Renaissance didn't end decadence, it just rebranded it. While Luther nailed theses to church doors, the Vatican was hosting fruits of the spirit banquets where cardinals gorged on sugar sculptures of the 12 apostles, then resurrected them by setting the table on fire for a caramelized finale. Now for the absurd twist: the edible etiquette of Versailles. Louis XIV's chefs developed a fart-preventing menu for state dinners, only for nobles to secretly bet on who could break wind most melodiously during speeches. The winner: a duchess who allegedly trained with opera singers. As the last wine stain spreads across the tablecloth, remember, no throne topples until its rulers choke on their own excess. The clatter of golden cutlery fades as we arrive at last in your own bedroom, where the ghosts of these royal debaucheries linger in modern scandals. That politicians leaked texts. The CEO's hushed settlement. They're just fruits of the spirit banquets with better PR. You swipe past a tabloid headline about some disgraced aristocrat, and for a heartbeat, Henry VIII's smirk flashes behind your screen. Historians still argue whether power corrupts or merely reveals, but when a 21st century prince winks at his close friend during a televised wedding, the echo of Richard the Lionheart's "What more shall I say?" hums through the centuries. Then there's the ultimate twist: the royal comeuppance clock. From Tiberius Capri exile to Epstein's Island, the playbook never changes. Only the props update, swapping witchcraft accusations for wellness retreats and pear-shaped torture devices for NDAs. The mainstream fact. Every #Me Too moment has a medieval precedent. When Christine de Pizan wrote the Book of the City of Ladies in 1405 to call out noble predators, she might as well have been drafting a Twitter thread. Now for the final bizarre footnote, the crypto condom. Just as Fallopio tested mercury sheaths, modern tech bros peddle blockchain chastity belts, apps tracking partners' virtue metrics. Some things never change. They just get an algorithm. The whispers of history grow softer now, like velvet drapes brushing stone floors in an abandoned palace. These stories of twisted crowns and tangled sheets aren't just scandal. They're reminders that power, in any era, thrums with the same dangerous electricity. But tonight, let it all fade. Let the weight of centuries slip from your shoulders as the fans hum blends with distant thunder. Imagine those gilded halls empty at last, their shadows dissolving into something kinder. The quiet of your own breath, the give of your mattress, the gentle promise that tomorrow's world might yet learn from yesterday's follies. The last candle gutters. The ghosts retreat. And you, dear listener, are finally free to drift beyond their grasp. Good night, sweet dreams.